I just want to welcome you. My name is Bill Thomas. I'm one of the ministers here at Silver Spire. This event started 7 or 8 months ago. We started thinking about it, maybe even longer than that. And then we started planning, and then a whole bunch of people got on board and joined us in the planning. And I have to tell you that this is great. I am really quite thrilled. One of my responsibilities here at Silver Spire is to coordinate a lot of the outreach work that happens here at the church. And so that has brought me into contact with a number of newcomers, refugees to the community, and the service agencies that support them. And so this, I think, is a really important day for us as a church and for us as a community. And I look forward to what is going to be shared from both sets of panels, and to the questions that you are all going to bring that will just increase the knowledge in the room. We here at Silver Spire recognize that we are guests on the traditional land of the Mississauga, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee nations. And so it is my pleasure to welcome Phil Davis to come forward from the local Native Center in Niagara-on-the-Lake and to share some words of welcome.
Sego, Ani, Gujo. What's up? Just said hello in a couple of different tongues. And I was asked to come and share a few words with you today. I'm just going to step down here. These lights are bright. I can't see anything. And for us as the Haudenosaunee, my name is Phil Davis. I'm a Mohawk from the Haudenosaunee peoples, the peoples of the Longhouse, Six Nations, Iroquois, whatever you may read in your text that you've seen. It's just the categories that they've given us over time. History has given us those names. But as the Haudenosaunee, we have what's called the Thanksgiving Address. And they are the words before all else of any type of gathering, of any type of business that we have. And it gives thanks to our Mother, the Earth, and everything in nature, and everything else that exists in order for us as human beings to survive. Because we all know we need as much help as we can get, right? These words are said before and they're said after, and it's in the acknowledging everything else that comes before us as humans. You know, that really keeps our feet on the ground and keeps us humble. You know, if we can take the time to recognize everything else before our own selves, then I think that says a lot about us as an individual, and also as a community and as a nation and as a whole. You know, these words I'm going to share with you. I'll share a little bit in the language. And I'll translate that a little bit, but the rest of it I'll share in English so that you can really encapsulate what is being said in those words. And in the original and traditional openings can go on for quite some time, but I won't be sharing those ones today because I've heard they can go on for days, because it can take that long. It actually take that long to thank everything that exists in nature to provide for us as human beings. So traditionally in my language, Ganyagahage Mohawk is Daitino Harado ne Onkoisua ne Agoego Scano Agahage Eito Noyo Duhage ne Ngoat Nigura. Us to them we give greetings, love, and understanding to all the peoples of the earth. And we now bring our minds together as one. And that's it was just one sentence in Mohawk. You know, and what we talk about in all of that is I'll try to do a Reader's Digest version, I guess. in English. We give greetings, love, and understanding to all the peoples of the earth, where the human beings dwell, for all the streams, the pools, the lakes, the trees, the medicines, the fruits, the corns, to the greater winds and the lesser ones, to the forest for their usefulness, to the animals that provide us with pelts for clothing and our sustenance for food. To our eldest brother, the sun, to our grandmother, moon, to the mighty warrior, the peacemaker, to the messenger of Creator, who bring us His will, and to the Creator, who is the ruler of all health and life. Yahweh. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to echo Reverend Thomas's welcome to you all, and I'm going to be the master of ceremonies for the day. So a couple of announcements, just of housekeeping issues. First of all, we would ask that if you have cell phones, that you either turn them off, or if you cannot turn them off, please put them on vibrate. The panel discussions and our keynote are being filmed by Niagara Online Worship. If you have any concerns about the back of your head or identity or anything showing on film, I would suggest that you sit at the rear of the right-hand section. The camera is focused on the stage, but just so that you know what is happening. As far as social media, if you are going to use social media, we would appreciate that you're careful and that pictures are not taken of others without their permission, so perhaps share tweets or send shots of large groups, and I hope you will respect that. If you need a washroom, at the back of the sanctuary on each side, there is a washroom. And I think that's about it for housekeeping announcements to get started. I'm going to call on Ton Campbell to give us an introduction. And I'm not going to say a lot about him because he is going to introduce himself within the introduction. But I will say he joins us today from Hamilton. So welcome and take it away.
Wonderful. Well, I was talking to Maria this morning asking how many people did she expect to show up, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. So welcome to you all. It is an honor and a privilege to share the stage with Yusuf and the panelists this morning. I want to get into this morning. I want to say thank you very much to Dorothy for putting this presentation together. But in the, respectful of time, I'm going to be going through this pretty quick. And if you are interested in the slides, I am sure she would be glad to provide this to you. But what we want to do this morning at this point is just really give you an overview of what immigration to Canada has looked like from the beginning to the present, to help us base our conversations and our discussions this morning. So just before I begin, how many of you in this room were not born in Canada? Look at that. Just take a look around the room. Keep your hands nice held high, right? These folks have come to Canada. Now, everybody should raise their hand, except a few maybe in this room. How many know that their family immigrated to Canada? Almost everyone here, right? Absolutely. So over the years, we're looking at the beginning. So I'm going to have, we're a little bit low tech today. So I'm going to say next to my guy at the back who's going to be switching our panels, right? So the movement of nationals of one country into another for the purpose of resettlement is central to Canadian history. It's basically who we are. There's so many terms that have been given to Canada, melting pot, being able to really accept people. And where did this begin? So we see that there's been different reasons as to why people have come to Canada. And, unfortunately, through the ages, we have seen some of those motivations not in the best of terms. But yet, it had still brought some amazing people and nationals to this country. Thank you so much for your introduction, though, this morning, Philip. We do honor where we are. And so we're looking at the beginning. The indigenous peoples lived on what was called Turtle Island. And we see, I'm not going to be able to read through all of the slides as I mentioned, but just we want to acknowledge, and I want us to say that. If you could read that the fourth bullet here, let's read it together. We acknowledge that today we are meeting on the traditional land of the Mississauga, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee nations in a spirit of peace, respect, and friendship under the dish with one spoon treaty. Powerful to know that we are here and we come under that banner of peace. And when I look out into an audience like this of so many faces and races in one under this banner today, it warms my heart, and I do want to say thank you again for the opportunity to be a part of this morning. Moving into the 1600s and 1700s, we see, how Canada was settled, who was settling in this country, and you can kind of see that it was from one particular area of the world, and it was to settle Canada. It was to grow a nation, and so they came. I know I don't look Scottish, but with the last name Campbell, some of my grandparents and great-grandparents, coming from Scotland, England, from Ireland. But you'll see again that it is kind of similar race. But then we look into the mid-early 1800s, and you have freedom seekers from the States coming up. And this is where we start seeing Canada as a haven, as a place of refuge, and Canada becoming open to welcoming people to come and to settle here. Then we look into a large-scale immigration into the West, right? Government still defined immigrants who did not come from the British Isles as foreign. And so we still have this bias, with people who are not from the UK or the British Isles, but we'll see soon that changes. Business and railroad interests pressed to increase immigration, and then we hear of the atrocities, people coming over and with the Chinese immigrants building the railroad to join Canada. 1890s to 1910, you'll see, again, not only do we see a mixing of nations, but also of religions and faiths. And I think what we've learned to become is a tolerant society. A society that is being able to welcome people from all faiths, all cultures. But it was not so in the beginning. So you'll see the various nations that people starting to come from. But in this interesting, I thought this was interesting, she included this, the ideal settler in the minds of people at this time, starting with the British and American, moving to the French, Belgian, Dutch, Scandinavians, right? And near the bottom, you have the Italians, the Slavs, the Greeks, the very bottom, the Jews, the Asians, right? And seeing how there was a scale put onto people coming. What I'm so glad of today when I walk into my children's school is how the acceptance for everyone, from all walks. And I love that I saw this, I don't know if you want to call it a meme or whatever it was on Facebook, and these children just playing together and saying racism isn't, you're not born with it, it's taught. And having these kids just be kids and playing with each other and just the purity in that. And so being able to look back, yeah, we started where we started, but then moving to where we are today. So moving into post-World War, immigration from Europe gradually increases. We'll see the population start to increase greatly. Cold War, racial discrimination and immigration removed from policies for the most part by like 1960s. So long time, right, until it's finally being handled on that level. 1971, the first year, the majority of those immigrating were from non-European ancestry. 1971, right? But at least it started. 1960s and 1970s, refugee reception as exception to immigration regulations, you'll see, right? In 1956, people from Hungary. 1968, people from Czechoslovakia. 1970s, the Vietnamese, what we refer to as the boat people, then Uganda and Chile. Looking to 1978, the new Immigration Act made admissions for refugees part of immigration law. I don't know why you're here today, or what your interest or what your connection is today. I have a few people who are getting into becoming immigration lawyers, and I appreciate what they do, working on behalf and advocating on behalf of immigrants and being able to have them come to Canada and really, for the most part, for refugees, saying they are fleeing, they need a place of refuge. And Hamilton, I'm honored to say, has become a city of refuge and a sanctuary for refugees. And so I'm very interested in today's discussion to hear about what's happening in the Niagara region. What are the tools that you are creating, and how well is this community building and wrapping itself around the new immigration population coming in. I stopped at this time because, just in reference to the 1970s, in 1970, I was born in 1973 in the country of Vietnam. In 1975, I ended up in an orphanage in the city of Saigon. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to tell the full story, but basically, long and short, I was brought out with an organization or part of a movement called Operation Baby Lift. And this was a movement or an effort to rescue these orphan babies from war-torn Vietnam in 1975 before the communist regime was going to take over Saigon. And so they flew these children out, called Operation Baby, thousands of children, diaspora, from the United States, UK, France. But Canada was taking the last group. And so the last group came in April of 1975, and the last flight, one went to Montreal, but the last flight happened in April of 1975. And we came to Toronto, and there was about 57 or 60 of us. They wanted to get 300 to 500, but they couldn't get that many to prove that they were true orphans. They had to be proven to be true orphans. No families were going to come looking for them. So we arrived in Canada, and we weren't really pre-adopted, but eventually they had enough phone calls go out to families, and families had agreed to adopt these children into their homes. And then that's how I got the great last name, Campbell, good Scottish last name. I've actually been to Scotland and was able to go to the Campbell Castle and sign the Clan Campbell. I'm in the books, right? I'm good. What was amazing, the story continues, and 30 years later I was actually able to reunite with 42 out of these 57 adoptees and hear of their stories of being integrated and how well they've been able to do in Canada because of these families who were able to bring them in and raise them in this wonderful country called Canada. Don't we live in the most wonderful country in the world? So Canada, absolutely. Last part of the story is that story went around the world, made it into the global news. Family read about the reunion of all these adoptees, connected with the name in the newspaper and this picture that was on the front cover. And they connected with the journalist, contacted me and said, we want to know if there's a connection to our baby son who was lost during Operation Baby Lift and this guy named Ton Campbell. And I kind of knew right away, but we exchanged some birth certificates and documents back and forth, and I looked at theirs and I looked at mine, and it was an exact match. An exact match. And then I looked at the translation. There was only difference between the dates of birth. One said August 1st, and theirs said May 1st, 1973. So we had to do one step further, and this is where I close. We had to do a DNA test just to prove there was no connection, because we had to be proven to be orphans to be on that flight. So I did this paternity test to kind of disprove any connection. We were told these papers were just official government documents to get us out of the country to expedite the process. And the results came back in January of 2007. The bottom it says probability of paternity equals 99.999%. 99.999%. And so I got a call saying, Ton, you in essence have found your father. And so I wrote my book, Orphan 32. Unfortunately, I've sold out of all the copies that I have. I don't have any here today. But if you're interested, I'd be glad to talk with you after. But what this story, even sharing it with people, is a story of hope. Coming to this country, Canada, is a story of hope for so many people. And as I tour across the country and I share my story, I open it up for people to share their story with me. And many times over have I had people come, share a more amazing story of how they just did what they had to do to get to this country. I have a friend in Hamilton. He was 10 years old from Liberia in a refugee camp, 10 years old, and he got himself here, graduated from McMaster, and runs an organization called what was it? I was blanking right now. But right now he's actually building the first library in Liberia, right? And so these people who are coming to Canada aren't just sitting around. They are doing something and they're helping their people. And that's what the opportunity in Canada can do for us. So you can see, we'll just go very quickly again, from 1933 to 1945. You know, from few to many, we had 5,000 from the Jewish population. 1970s, 50,000, they say, boat refugees came over, to now 2015, Syrian refugees, 25,000, and more are coming every day. More recently, public concern over refugee claimants. Canada should select refugees, not allow refugees to select Canada. I'm going to let you kind of just settle with that comment and see how that rests with you. Late 80s and early 1990s, introductions of entrepreneurial and business class immigrants, bringing people here who are going to be contributing and assets to our economy and to our communities. 2002 Immigration and Refugees Protection Act, preference to multi-skilled workers, again, looking for people who are going to be benefiting and being a blessing to this community. Look at this though, in 2011, approximately 6.7 million people born outside the country, which is 1 in 5 or 20% of the population. Right, that was in 2011. 2006 to 2011, we received 1.1 million immigrants from these countries: Middle East and Asia, Europe, Africa, Caribbean, and then Central America and South America. These are great stats, and again, I'm sorry we had to go through it so quickly this morning, but we do want to get to our panel discussions. But here we are, a case for immigration. Census 2016, fertility takes a backseat to immigration in Canada's growth. In other words, we're not having as many kids as we used to. You know, 1 or 2 children families are considered big. Two family, children families are big. I have 4. Some people's eyes rolled in the back of their head going, how do you manage that? And I said, yeah, they all play hockey and go to private school, right? So they think I'm crazy. 60 plus age group growing, and we have a low birth rate. So our populace is going down, we would say, due to this. Services such as health, education, and our social safety net needs hundreds of thousands of taxpayers just to be able to hold that infrastructure. What do the numbers say, right? Looking at this, the economic class, the family class, seeing what we have and who is coming to this country, who is making up this country of Canada right now. There are over 21 million refugees around the world. Staggering number. 21 million refugees around the world. According to UN, we are witnessing the highest numbers of displaced people ever. Someone always asks me, do you think we'll ever learn? I think we'll ever learn war and what it's causing. Now, some people ask me, Ton, do you regret coming to Canada? Do you wish you had stayed in your own country? And I said, not a day in my life goes without me thanking for my life here in Canada. I don't wish the heartbreak that happened to my parents, that I was separated from them. But the life that I have here in Canada, I would not change for anything. And so, yet, war, strife, happening every day, breaking apart families, breaking apart communities. What can you do? What can we do as communities? First of all, to bring that message of hope to the world, to the communities, to our families. We look at the current situation, for an example, the Syrian refugee crisis. Look at these numbers, right? How are we unfolding? How are we wrapping ourselves around these people? Especially under the circumstances that you see at the bottom. Many of these people experiencing trauma and having to deal with that. How do we help them? Not just find places to live, not just, find schools for their children to go to school, but how are we meeting their emotional needs? How are we making them feel welcome, that this is a safe place for them to come? So specifically here in Niagara, from 2012, the present Niagara Folk Arts Multicultural has served 4,509 newcomers and refugees. That's fantastic, right? Look at this, 293 Syrians since 2015. They make up 16% of all refugees served by this center. Of the 4,509 total people served, right, 7% of those were Syrian refugees. Do we have any Syrian refugees here in the room today? Moving on, outstanding today. The region of Niagara says that 10.4% of Niagara's population immigrated here in the last 5 years. So we're seeing an increase here of how many people are coming to this specific region. And that's why we're here today, to talk about what is happening here specifically. Just coming to the last 2 slides here to help us set the stage for our discussion. But you can see the countries currently in this region. The past 2 years, the past 5 years, the past 10 years. From 2008 to the present. So in closing, I want to say, first of all, thank you to the panelists who are going to be joining us, but also for you, as you open your hearts and your minds to the questions that you want to ask. We are going to have time at the end of the panel discussion for your questions, and we will have a mic going down the center so that you can have that. But we do ask that you honor people who are giving their responses here on stage. I want to thank you to Yusuf for co-moderating this with me this morning. But ask yourselves as well, how would you answer these questions? And what are we going to do together, right? This is just the beginning. What are we going to do together to make this the best place to accept immigrants from around the world? I'll ask our MC to come forward.
Thank you very much, Ton. Ton has mentioned the process for the group panel discussion. I'm going to ask the panelists and our co-moderator to come and take their places now, please. And as they are doing that, I'll just repeat that the panelists are going to go through some questions that the planning team worked on, and then there will be a time for questions from the audience, and Reverend Bill will be in the center aisle with the handheld mic to take those questions. I did leave out one housekeeping announcement. I will say that we are a downtown church, and today our doors are wide open. So I would like you to pay attention to the security of your personal belongings while you are here. It is good to keep them with you and to be aware of where your possessions are. So I think we are all ready to go here, and I know that the panelists are going to be introduced by our co-moderators. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me and being here today. My name is Yusuf Al-Harazi, and I'll be the co-moderator today. So I would just like to introduce the esteemed panel that we have with us today. So on my immediate left, we have Rohena Saqib, and she is settlement workers in schools for the YMCA of Niagara. Next to Rohena is Velma Lang, now retired, but language assessor, ESL language assessor for the YMCA as well. And next to Velma is Jeff Birch, Executive Director of the Niagara Folk Arts Multicultural Center. Then we have Moses Moini, who is the Refugee Program Coordinator for MCC Ontario. And next to Moses, we have Martha Mason, who is the Executive Director for the Fort Erie Multicultural Center. So thank you very much for being here, and we hope it will be a fruitful discussion for everyone involved. So the format of the panel will be as follows. Each panelist, when I ask you a direct question, you'll have approximately 5 minutes to answer that question. If anyone else wants to jump in terms of a follow-up to that answer, you may do so. So, getting right into it, we'll start with Jeff. So Jeff, you know that we had the Syrian refugee crisis and the influx of Syrian refugees in Niagara. So considering this experience, what did Niagara learn about refugee resettlement from specifically the Syrian refugee program?
Great. Well, thanks for the question, Yusuf. First, I'd just like to thank Silver Spire and Dorothy Franklin and the organizing committee for doing such a great job organizing this today. It's been a lot of work, and you can see by the turnout what an impressive job they did, so thank you very much. Lessons learned in Niagara. I'm extremely proud of the reaction of not only the service providers, but all of the agencies and the regional government as well in Niagara. We came together fairly quickly under the Niagara Refugee Assistance Committee, and there were 40 or 50 organizations that actually came together and started preparing for the influx of Syrian refugees. What can be done better? I think can be understood on a provincial level. There are two main categories of refugees that came. One is government-assisted refugees, and the other is privately sponsored refugees. Government-assisted refugees are sponsored by the government. When they come to Canada, in Ontario, they head to one of 7 main reception areas in major cities, and they're supported by the government for a year. Privately sponsored refugees are sponsored by groups of 5 or other organizations, and much of the what the refugee families need when they get to Canada is pre-arranged by those groups as part of an agreement. We organized in Niagara to receive a lot of government-assisted refugees, and none came. And the reason none came is because they went to the reception areas and they stayed there. And that was due to some technical issues with their benefits, lack of communication, I would say some lack of cooperation between reception areas and outlying areas. And so our committee organized for things like finding housing and things that government-assisted refugee families need. And what happened is we got more privately sponsored refugees than we anticipated. So we actually got, in Niagara, probably over 400 individual Syrian refugees, but they were almost all privately sponsored. And they have different needs than government-assisted refugees. So we had to really change our focus to privately sponsored refugee families. So next time I think there needs to be more communication between the local level, the province, the federal government, so that we understand what families are coming here and what their needs are going to be, so that we can prepare to meet those needs.
Thank you for your answer. Just as a follow-up actually to that answer, there were some tools that were used, such as the Syrian Information Portal. Can you comment on some of the best practices through this experience with some of those tools?
Sure. Well, I think the main best practice was just the way that everyone came together, the Moses and the Mennonite Central Committee, kind of showing the leadership among privately sponsoring groups. The service organizations like Fort Erie Multicultural Center and the Welland Heritage Council, that everyone came together and got on the same page, and that allowed us to really cooperate and make sure that as the families arrived, we were able to provide them with the services they needed as quickly as possible. And so I think that cooperation between local governments, service organizations, and local service agencies was really the best practice that we learned.
Thank you very much.
I will encourage the other panelists to be prepared. If you do want to say anything, you can raise your hand and then we can pass the mic. So does any of the other panelists have any response to that? What's worked in Niagara? What could be done better?
I would like to say, as a member of the sponsorship committee at Grace United in Niagara-on-the-Lake, that having had to deal with a great many health problems with our family, that we had a number of difficulties finding interpreters. And I believe that is one area that might have been better organized in a way to help us get them through all these problems that they had. And interpreters were, they have jobs, they work, and they're not always available. So it was a difficulty, and I'm going to, give all credit due to the services that we had, which were amazing, but we needed a little more guidance, I think, in finding those interpreters.
Thank you. Anybody else have anything to add? I'm just going to also ask you to maybe raise your mic up a little bit. Could everybody hear? We just want to do a sound. No? Okay. So I think the premise of that, the answer was the lack of interpreters was that we need to be able to, if we know which cultural group are coming, making sure that we have enough hands on deck to be able to interpret and translate. Anyone else? Yes. If you can speak into the mic.
Yeah, the other thing to note is for us as a sponsorship agreement holder with the Government of Canada, one of the biggest challenges that we encountered was communication really wasn't flowing as we hoped. One of the things in December, as the influx of the Syrians actually intensified, we were getting notices of arrivals in about 24 hours. So to just rally the groups to be ready within 24 hours, to be told that your family is coming, was something that was concerning, and especially in the month of December when people are preparing for Christmas and other events. It left so many sponsors disappointed, but yet what was amazing was that They still responded. They still went to the airport. They still ensured that there was a house, there was food for these newcomers. So people were just able to pull their resources very, very quickly in a very short time. But better communication would have ensured that we prepared better. There was also another comment about need for interpreters, and there's also the other issue with high medical needs and trauma that so many of the Syrian refugees, not only Syrians, the Syrians anyways, because we're focusing on Syrians, I'll talk about Syrians, that they came with very high medical needs, trauma, postpartum depression, and all those resources are actually lacking in the Niagara. And the other thing is, of course, looking big picture in the country, nationwide. Also, the wait lines of people on waiting for those services is so high, but could we have organized ourselves better? I know in the Niagara region, we were able to connect with various medical professionals, dentists and doctors and so forth, but the area of mental health was a huge area that we could have done a lot better in preparing.
Thank you, Moses. Imagine that, and let's just add to that. So if Niagara region is lacking in the counseling services for those dealing with trauma, then add the language barrier. Do we have enough resources in this community to serve a predominantly Arabic community coming in? Do we have Arabic counselors? And so, great point. Absolutely. Thank you. Let's move on. This next section, we're getting into general policy protocols with a focus on specifically Niagara. So government immigration and refugee programs. Jeff kind of touched on a little bit the difference of how people are coming in. But Martha, this is for you. What types and models are there right now of ways to sponsor refugees? And in comparison, how are immigrants allowed to enter Canada today?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel.
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So immigration is pretty complicated. There's lots of different ways that immigrants and refugees can enter Canada. In terms of sponsorship, there's government sponsorship, which Jeff did talk about briefly. In Niagara, historically, we have not participated directly in government-sponsored refugee programs. They tend to be directed towards specific areas of Canada. Our closest location is Hamilton. And as Jeff explained, we did attempt to arrange a relationship, and there was some government barriers, shall we say. There's private sponsorship. Usually, private sponsorship can happen either through a sponsorship agreement holder, something like what Moses was speaking about with the Mennonite Central Committee. I know the Catholic Diocese, the Anglican Diocese, the United Church of Canada are sponsored holders. So various private sponsors within those faith communities can under that sponsorship agreement holder, arrange to become a private sponsor in their community or in their faith community. There's also community sponsorships where we call them groups of 5. So individuals in a community can come together and decide to become a sponsor. There's a lot of involved in becoming a sponsor, as some of you will appreciate, those of you who are sponsors and those who arrange them. You have to have a plan, and there's a long application process. I think in terms of the Syrian refugees, there was some frustration with the length of time that you had to wait, and then, as Moses was saying, all of a sudden your family's here, and you've made lots of arrangements ahead of time, and all of a sudden you have to have everything ready in 24 hours. That was one of the challenges I think that many of the private sponsors were dealing with. Another way to sponsor is through family reunification. So people who have been here for a time can decide they want their parent to come, or maybe a child or children or siblings, and so they can apply. It's not necessarily the same system, but it is a form of sponsoring a family member, and it comes under the family reunification program. Sponsorship assistance from the government is, so a government sponsorship, refugee would be supported by the federal government. The private sponsor raises the funds, and in some instances the private sponsor will, it's called a joint program, so the government will help at a halfway point or three-quarter point. And there are some variables there that the private sponsor can engage in. There's, in terms of right now, 2017, there's a limit on the number of private sponsors that can apply for sponsorship. And I think that has something to do with the new applications, not so much people who are already involved in the process. So, and in terms of the number of refugees that are targeted for 2017, I believe the number is 25,000. 16,000 is a private number target, 7,500 is a government-assisted refugee sponsor target, and 1,500 blended, and that's the sort of in part paid by the government, in part paid by the private sponsor under the sponsorship program. So that's just kind of a summary of the sponsorship program. There's there's a lot more detail involved. I think the length of time was something that was experienced as challenging for the people who were private sponsors. I think what we saw in Niagara, at least from my observation, was a lot of new sponsors, people who hadn't done it before, and so for them it was a maiden voyage and a steep learning curve in some instances. So coming together, I think on the other side of it is some opportunities to talk about that experience and what we could do better next time. I know the federal government, I participated in some conversations about how we can do it better next time in terms of the federal government input, which was limited. I heard from various sponsors that I talked to, and so helping the sponsors to become better prepared, better informed about what was going on. What do we do about this? How can we handle that? So some of the details I think were missing in those dialogues.
All right.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Before we go in, I have the pleasure of doing an announcement here. We have a white Grand Caravan. I'm going to give the license plate BKVA 803 and a gray Dodge Avenger license plate BZCM 118. They are in the doctor's parking lot and they're being asked to move as soon as possible. We won't look and see who gets up. But a follow-up question for me is there any workshops for people like me saying, so you want to be a sponsor? Are there any kind of sessions that could help individuals or groups that say, okay, this is what you got to do, this is who you go see?
Yeah, as I understand it, the Y of Niagara is working on that piece, and I'm not really clear on what's happening specifically, but I know it's something that has been acknowledged as an issue, and they're working on it. Okay. So there will be more information coming on that.
Yeah, I can speak to that as a sponsorship agreement holder. We do those trainings to train our constituent groups that are interested in knowing more about the private sponsorship program. Because our program is mostly focused for groups that are working through us, one of the things that we continuously have received the inquiries from people is, okay, we want to consider sponsoring through Group of 5. Because for us as sponsorship agreement holders, we are limited in the number of applications that we can submit each year. This year, for example, we're given 60 spots. Those are for 60 people, so if you're looking at an average family size of 5, we are looking at only 12 applications. So we have guided people to consider either the Group of 5 or community sponsorship option. I understand how complex and challenging those forms are. About 2 months ago, I organized an information session at the Niagara Folk Arts Multicultural Center and invited resource people from the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, and there is the Refugee Support Program that is that was created by a group of lawyers who have volunteered to assist groups that are interested in doing either community sponsorship or group of 5. So if anybody is interested in doing that, get in touch with me. I'll connect you to resources. We have resources.
That's great. Thank you. So I do want to stay with Moses on this next question. How can we as a community locate, connect, and mobilize resources for successful sponsorship? And what do sponsorship agreement holders consider best practices?
Okay, thanks Yusuf, and thanks also to the organizers of this forum. I will respond to that question by sharing a story of one of the groups that we are working with. As Canadians scrambled to mobilize resources in 2015, I was approached by a pastor of Grace Mennonite Church in St. Catharines. This outreach pastor came and said, Moses, we in our church want to do something. We need to respond to the crisis of refugees. But the truth is, I'm over 60 years old and I'm a youth in our church. So what can we do to respond? My response was, I have a plan. What about partnership with the mosque? And his question was, okay, how do we do that? Then I said, okay, I'll do it. Following Friday, I went to the mosque, presented the mosque with this vision, and an interested partnership began to form. When that partnership started forming, the question that they asked themselves was, what are we really wanting to accomplish if we join in refugee sponsorship? So by responding to that question, the two partners explored some compassionate and creative ways of reaching out to the Syrian refugees. And through the process, one of the members said, by working together, we'll not only help some people find a safe home here in Canada, but we will set a model for cooperative community-serving efforts in spite of our differences. That was really profound. After that meeting, the outreach pastor went back to his congregation to affirm the idea of partnering with the local mosque in the sponsorship of a Syrian refugee. Immediately, there was a strong support and offers of funds were made. Within weeks, another meeting was set up. Muslim Mennonites, and now another partner actually came on board, the Quakers. That energy and vision was so deep and it was so clear, and within a few meetings, the name Bridge of Hope was emerged in response to that question about the goal of the sponsorship. Before the end of 2015, Bridge of Hope had raised almost $40,000, and a refugee family had been identified for sponsorship, with a commitment made to Mennonite Central Committee for more sponsorships to follow. By the end of 2016, the family of 4 had arrived and settled very well in St. Catharines. The settlement team at the Bridge of Hope made mostly of members from the mosque with Arabic language skills as well as cultural competence, provided that much needed support, and then a tutoring team to supplement English language classes at the Folk Arts Multicultural Center had also been created by the Mennonite community. Throughout 2016, the Bridge of Hope kept on expanding in numbers and vision. In November, the Niagara Falls Mosque also joined, making a significant financial contribution. A United Church and another Mennonite churches have also joined. Their funds are now over $70,000 and climbing. 3 more Syrian families have been applied through Mennonite Central Committee. So as a community, we can learn a lot from Bridge of Hope in how they successfully located, connected, and mobilized resources for successful sponsorship of refugees. So what do we need to know? First, we need to have a vision of being a solution to refugee crisis and to be able to see the opportunities in it. We have to be intentional and to pursue strategic partnerships in the community and the wider community, and then to invite those folks into that partnership. And then we need to connect with various levels of government, We need to connect with businesses. We need to connect with members of parliament. We need to connect with all those significant stakeholders in our communities and invite them to the partnership. Resources of money need to be made available by businesses and individuals in the communities. And members of the community also should be willing to support as well. What are the best practices? For us as sponsorship agreement holders, the goal is not to bring a refugee from a refugee camp in Lebanon to Canada and to let that family linger in that environment where they don't have enough support. So we urge that the group has to be well organized and with clearly identified roles and a vision for welcoming a newcomer into the community. In each group, there has to be a community chair, financial coordinator, housing coordinator, medical or health coordinator, education coordinator, transportation coordinator, shopping and social committee organizer. We have to have those coordinators in place to be able to provide support in the various areas of settlement. The members of this sponsoring group have to have some basic understanding of providing settlement support, including emotional and social support to newcomers. When we invite newcomers and welcome them into Canada, we can't work with a strategic plan and say, okay, after 2 months you should be speaking this level of English. After 6 months you should be working. After 1 year, and then you're independent. You are working with people that you have no idea of what they have gone through. Be patient with these people, understand them, be able to read into their emotions, and that social support that you provide should not be guided by some kind of strategic planning, but by the love and the compassion that in the first place brought you together as sponsors. And then also to know about the joys and challenges of sponsorship. Some sponsorships end up great, others are challenging. People don't choose to be challenging. Circumstances make things challenging for people to work with. Working with newcomers requires an understanding of another culture. Learning about the country of origin of the refugee you are sponsoring can be very helpful to know the history, customs, food, language, and social norms. Managing expectations. As sponsors, it is important to realize that your expectations as sponsors must be reasonable and realistic. As I mentioned, working with a strategic plan for a time to phase out a family that you have sponsored really isn't the best practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And actually, it's excellent to know that we have a good example such as the Bridge of Hope collaboration that has impacted Niagara and allowed for different faith groups to come together and participate in sponsorship. So now moving on slightly to municipal, provincial, and federal policies up top and how that affects the work that we do at the ground level. So I do want to bring in Rohena when I ask, where do you see tensions between some of these government policies and some of our hopes as settlement agencies or sponsors?
Thank you so much for this opportunity to share my opinion. I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a bad cough, so excuse me if I cough in between. The expectations, actually, I would like to talk a little bit about that. Expectations, as you know, is a normal and an important part of our life. We frame all our present and future decisions on our past experiences, on our perceptions, emotions, desires. Sometimes they might be based without a rational basis, or sometimes with very little information available. And expectations can be a very powerful thing. They can motivate us if they are set high and we achieve them, and if they can also cause us extreme grief if we are unable to meet them. And most of the newcomers that come to Canada have this rosy outlook of how their life would be in Canada. They expect a lot, and once they get here, the ground realities are very different. Especially immigrants and refugees or newcomers that come to Canada, if they have an extensive work experience or if they're really highly educated, for them not being able, employability is a big issue for them, and for some it is their work is their identity. And when that expectation is not met, they can suffer a lot. Their health their mental health and physical health can be affected. According to Statistics Canada, they did a longitudinal study on newcomers to Canada, and they asked for their responses after 6 months, 2 years, and after 4 years. And this was the biggest thing that they found challenging of life here in Canada, was their employability. And as settlement agencies, our biggest role is to let these newcomers support them and empower them, and to help set and nurture realistic goals of life here in Canada, and as well as develop skills for them so they can make their life successful here.
So just as a follow-up, Rohina, I know that you work in schools, predominantly high schools in Niagara. So considering their age, so the newcomers that are, let's say, under 18, do you notice any culture clashes or conflicts or, like you said, expectations in those youth? And what are some examples of those clashes?
Yes, as our role, we provide settlement services to families and youth in high schools and in elementary schools as well. The biggest challenge, yes, I think the newcomer youth is torn between two different worlds of what the expectation is for them at home and what expectation is from their peers. So they do find it very challenging. We have and some of these youth have actually suffered a lot because they might come here as unaccompanied minors, as refugees, or they might come under circumstances where they did not have, they didn't get enough literacy or education, and there was a big gap in that. For them to cover that gap is a struggle. And most of the times we, and of course I would like to mention again the lack of mental health resources that we have, especially in different languages.
Thank you very much for that answer. Velma.
Yes. I would like to comment on Rohina's role and her team's role in the schools. About 15 years ago, I went to a couple of forum or conferences where I was hearing from settlement workers and social assistance workers that many children were having real struggle in school, being accepted, becoming behavior problems. There was even talk of some gang activity going on. These were children in distress, and I heard the distress from their workers who were dealing with them. And the schools, in fact, as a teacher, I was extremely upset that teachers were not able to deal with these problems. Quite obviously, it was overwhelming for many of them, with many refugee children, especially in their classes, mostly from South America at that time. So having worked with Rohina and her team and the workers in the schools over these many years, I have heard such wonderful things about what's happened in the schools. The teachers are happy to have this support. The children and families are happy that their children are doing well. I listened to many parents tell me how happy their children were in schools. That was such a change from what I had heard many years ago. So we need to thank this team from the Y and all of those people in the schools and their teachers who have really worked hard to make this happen.
Great. I'd like to just chime in a little bit about this organization Leo Johnson started in Hamilton called Empowerment Squared. And what he does is an after-school tutoring program for these new immigrant youth. And what it gives is an opportunity, first of all, to show that they're not alone, right? They can talk with other refugee youth and work together. And then we have tutors from around the city who come down, volunteer their time on Thursday afternoons, and work with these kids. So first of all, it's showing that the community cares and that they're loved. And we've seen these kids, since it started, go through, first of all, get the ESL that they need, but then be able to, once they have the grasp on the language, being able to do better in school, achieve success in school, and then we see them achieve success in life. And it's very exciting when programs like this through the Y and different organizations can take this issue and find solutions. And it's people like yourselves, volunteers, people from the community who stand up and say, I want to do something, I want to help. So back, and this can open up to the full group here. When we talk about government, you know, it's easy to lean on the negative, but let's go on both sides. Where have the layers of government, federal to municipal and community, succeeded in policy, planning, and implementation of settlement services, and where have they fallen short? Where could they grow? Anyone?
I'd like to comment.
Yes.
Yeah, I would like to just mention some regard that our organization has for the Y and the Swiss program, simply because it's it is the only organization that has formally been able to integrate refugee claimant children and who are not eligible for service under the federal government, which is one of the downsides, and the eligible children in the same program. So I know a lot of work went into those negotiations, and I think it's something that that is very commendable. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, because the refugee claimant community, which is our dominant population in Fort Erie, is a fairly substantial. I mean, we have a fairly substantial entry volume in Fort Erie, probably about 100,000 in the last 25 years. They're not all here in Niagara, but there's certainly been a lot of people that have come through the gateway. And in terms of the federal government, there are certainly programs that allow for the processing of claimants, but there are specific challenges for them that are unique, that don't necessarily apply to other types of immigrants or refugees. So it's just an area that we've always been working on. And in terms of the Y, it's one success, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to pick up on that and some of the things that Moses said earlier, a lot of people don't realize that the federal government especially funds programs that really address pretty much every need that a newcomer has. And between the Y, Folk Arts, Fort Erie Multicultural Center, and Well Heritage Council, we have programs to pretty much address every need from the time the family arrives, school, infant and toddler care while the parents are in English, what groceries to buy, making friends, volunteer opportunities, and traveling around the province with a provincial committee that I sit on. There's some real difficulties in other areas where sponsoring groups don't necessarily realize those services are there. And these sponsors who really have very little expertise in settlement are trying to do all the work themselves. Here in Niagara, because we developed a relationship early on, we had settlement staff learning about what organizations like Mennonite Central Committee do, and we had sponsors who actually ended up coming and signing the immigrant families up for services before they even arrived. So it's something we did really well here in Niagara, and you know, I think that's something the federal government can encourage in the future.
I think also events like today, you know, inviting the public to come in, be educated, hear a panel of experts, and then being able to bring that back to their groups is fantastic as well. So, yeah, that's great. Areas, so it sounds like communication with all the parties. Is there anyone that is kind of in charge of making sure of all these groups, you know, governmental and then NGO, are talking together? Is anybody aware of who's taken on that task?
Sure, if anyone's in charge, but we do have a local immigrant partnership run through the region and sponsored by the federal government that meets on a fairly regular basis, and that's really their job to try and make sure throughout the year that all of those services are connected and people are talking to each other. And here in Niagara, as I mentioned, we started the Refugee Assistance Committee on our own initiative, and that took on that role as well.
Excellent. That's great.
Yeah. Let me also mention about, excuse me, OCASI is an organization called Ontario Council for Agencies Serving Immigrants. That is one of the organizations that...
Can you repeat the name of that? Ontario?
OCASI.
OCASI.
Yeah.
OCASI.
Yeah. OCASI.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Council of Associations Serving Immigrants. And then there is the RSTP, which is the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. So one of the things, given the challenges that we have run into with newcomers arriving and with the sponsoring group really not knowing where to go for resources or for support, is to have some of these intentional collaborations where, for example, if I have a meeting of the sponsorship agreement holders here in the Niagara, I would connect with Jeff at the Folk Arts Multicultural Center. Then he would send one of the settlement workers to be able to explain to all the sponsorship agreement holders of all the services that are offered by the Folk Arts Multicultural Center. In that process, we learn of services that are available, and then we are able also to communicate to our sponsors so that they don't end up doing all the work themselves. So as this continues to grow in all the various parts of Ontario, I think we are resourcing ourselves and preparing ourselves to be able to provide better settlement services for the newcomers and with excellent outcomes.
Excellent, yes.
Yeah, and another organization that is a resource and a connector is the Canadian Council for Refugees. They're located in Montreal. They're a national organization with approximately 180 member agencies across Canada. The Fort Erie Multicultural Center is a member agency. And their work is to be an advocate for the systems that support the refugees and all of the various aspects of immigration policy legislation. Right now, the Council is lobbying with the Canadian government to do something about the Safe Third Country Agreement, something I'm going to be talking about this afternoon if you've signed up for the breakout session. But it is an organization that can provide resources and support. There is a consultation happening in Niagara at the end of November, early December, the Niagara 2017 Canadian Council for Refugee consultation if you're interested. There is information available in the display area of this forum on the third floor.
Excellent. That's great. Well, let's move on into this next section, and we are going to be trying to keep to the time so that we do have time for questions and answers, so we want to start that at 11:40, but talking about an inclusive Niagara, right? Being able to welcome and accept and make people feel welcome and accepted. To this statement development, language learning is the key to inclusivity through interaction, participation, and formal education? How can the community facilitate language learning more effectively when economic factors or the need to make a living take precedence?
Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I will be, speaking to you from the perspective of 25 years and more working with immigrants and refugees, and I feel very much at home with this panel. I've known and worked with them for many years, and it feels like coming home, so thank you very much. I have been thinking about this question since I formulated it and sent it to the organizers. And I've been thinking about it with some chagrin. However, I will give you some facts, and we have been asked to dispel some myths. So I didn't realize there were so many myths about language learning until last year when our church in Niagara-on-the-Lake sponsored a refugee family, and I'm very pleased that Hala is here today, one of our family. But I was hearing from our congregation things like, the first myth, they'll have English classes with an Arabic-speaking teacher, won't they? Well, most of the people in this room who have taught ESL will, chuckle to themselves about that. That is a myth, that all these people who come into a classroom have a teacher who speaks their language. This is an English immersion program that we provide and are provided by the multicultural centers, by the school boards. They are free classes for anyone who comes into the country. They can start immediately. And for those those teachers who are in this room, they will recognize what a wonderful classroom those classrooms are when you get so many diverse people coming into that room, and they don't need their own language. They need to learn English, and so that classroom becomes a very safe haven for them to learn English. The Centre for Canadian Language Benchmarks is a national standard of measuring abilities in English for reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So they are, their slogan or motto is "Language is the key," and I've always felt that language is the key. So my question was, how can people learn a language when they have to make a living? And one of the very real dilemmas that we have had as teachers, as we have watched many students come into our classroom and then disappear because they've been offered a job, they need a job, and so their language learning does not become the focus of their time. It becomes a revolving door, and this revolving door is of a lot of concern to administrators and teachers and to students themselves. Another myth that I was hearing was, and I think Ton or Moses maybe spoke about the fact that after 6 months, don't they have a job yet? I was hearing this and thinking it takes 7 to 10 years to learn a language, and to learn it so that you do interact and participate in Canadian society. So that language learning process is a very complex, a process that's fraught with all sorts of difficulties along the way. The paradox about language being the key is that language learning will lead to inclusion in the society, quite obviously. you're able to go to the store, you're able to talk with the bus driver, you're able to participate in conversations on the street. But the paradox is that inclusion also leads to better language. So how do we get people who have to make a living get to understand English better, or French if they live in Quebec, of course. Breaking this language barrier is not the easiest thing. And you may hear this afternoon from some of the people who come from other countries about their experiences with language. And it would be very interesting to hear how they have overcome some of these barriers. The other issue about language learning is that our programs are a continuous intake program. That means that they come one day, and as I said, they may leave in 2 months, they may leave in 3 months. Some people do manage to spend quite a long time in class, which they are allowed to. But this continuous intake means that it is a continuously a continuous approach to learning, and sometimes that learning is definitely hindered and impeded by the fact that they go for a job. I mean, how do you learn English in a greenhouse when everybody there speaks Spanish? How do you learn English in a hotel in Niagara Falls when everybody speaks the same language, who are working on the same floor as you are as a cleaner? So there are many difficulties in language learning, which I wanted to sort of address with this question, but as I thought more and more about it, it became more and more complicated. And consequently, I wanted to have us think about how the community can facilitate this whole process. The other issue that it is a conundrum because all of these life happens, all of these life happenings affect the language learning. The other issue which Rohina referred to, sorry, it seems to want to fall. So can everyone hear me? All right. Okay. Oh, is this better? Maybe? Okay. Maybe. The other issue which Rohina referred to was that there are some people who come to the country, as our refugee family did, with no English, but there are many, like Rohina herself, who are absolutely fluent, and some have very, very high levels of education. They may have been educated in English. They may come from a country like India, where English is the lingua franca of the business world. So what are their problems with language? Well, the other myth that I felt I needed to dispel was that language is reading, writing, listening, speaking, but it's much, much more than that. Language is culture. Our Canadian English is really quite different than South African English or many other types of English found around the world. So these people too have those barriers. How do they become involved in the national conversation? Because we are talking all the time about our cultural events and our cultural life. So in this case, someone with very good English might be coming into the country, but hearing so many things they do not understand. So such as, our Canadian English is the Battle of Queenston Heights, the last Netflix series that we watched, the Terry Fox run, NAFTA, Indigenous issues and claims to land, the changes to citizenship, which are actually happening, I believe, this week sometime, the price of gas, where to find the cheapest bananas. Should Sidney Crosby have gone to the White House? Why can't I physically discipline my child? So many issues that are cultural and need to be addressed. So the upshot is that language is the key, and I'm going to ask, what can the community do to facilitate this process? We've heard from the other panel members so many good initiatives about what the community can do. In this case, I'd just like to leave you with a story. One of these settlement workers from the Folk Arts Multicultural Center spoke to a group of people that I had convened to listen to her story about being a refugee from Colombia. She had come to Canada to save her life and the lives of her children. She was working with an older group of people, 50 plus, young seniors, and she wanted to get them involved, to get them included in the community so that they would better learn English, because it is harder to learn as we get older. It takes a lot more effort and a lot more energy and so on. So her appeal to the group was, would you people be able to join with my group of seniors to talk with them and socialize with them and have a cup of tea? And this was her effort to, help them learn better English. I was rather disappointed to find, and it's very natural, I think. I think we've seen this in all our sponsoring groups as well. Very hard to talk to somebody who speaks very little English. How do you break that barrier? How do we, as English speakers, break that barrier? So the answers were, well, why don't you take them to the community center in Niagara Falls where they can meet and talk? What we failed to do as a group was to include them. And the settlement worker was just asking them to include these people, not necessarily just to make their language better, but to make them feel that they really were Canadian. Thank you.
Thank you. And just picking up on that point, and this question is open to all who wish to answer. When we look at Canada in general, we see it's a multicultural country. The bigger cities, you're more used to seeing diverse faces, diverse cultures, languages, hearing all sorts of sights, seeing and hearing all sorts of sights and sounds. When you come now to the smaller cities, such as the Niagara region or St. Catharines specifically, I want to check the pulse of Niagara a little bit in terms of the local residents of Niagara. From what you're hearing, from who you're engaged with, I'm wondering if you can answer, is Niagara an inclusive society in terms of its local residents, the Canadian population? What is their relationship with newcomers and things like that? Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, again, from my perspective of long years in this area, back in the 90s, I was working the Y and the Multicultural Center where I was teaching, and the Employment Help Center were working on a program to help some laid-off unemployed workers. And I remember distinctly a lot of the hostility and resentment about these people being offered jobs. Don't send anyone with an accent. No, we can't train these people to do what we need to do. And it was a very difficult situation at that point. People were afraid for their jobs and so on. And I think that has changed quite a lot in the last 25 years. With our refugee family, we have seen wonderful, wonderful people in St. Catharines and Niagara. They've offered, bus drivers have offered to just let them ride the bus because they forgot their bus pass. All sorts of kindnesses. So I think in a lot of ways people are much more receptive and understanding about newcomer needs, and that's just what I've observed in time.
So just to follow up on that a little bit, and again, this is for whoever wishes to answer though, what do you find makes people who are born and raised in Niagara feel uncomfortable about immigrants or refugees? Velma mentioned some of those things, but is there any other thing that stands out to you that local residents are simply uncomfortable? Is it the fear of the unknown, or what would you say it is?
I think there's a lot of mythology. I think it's just about having conversations all the time and just keeping the conversation going to shatter those myths and help people understand. And I think in terms of inclusivity, I think we have made a lot of progress, but there's always, it's a work in progress. There's always things that we can do to help people feel like they belong. So I think the ingredient of getting together is one piece, and as Velma said, when they feel like they're included is the other piece. And so when they're both together, those are important things to have simultaneously.
Go ahead.
I think I would agree with my fellow panelists, and I think things have got better, but I think there's also a danger in being too complacent. If we're honest, we've had some fairly disturbing incidents in Niagara of racism, not just in one particular city, but in various locations. We've had a white supremacist group has set up in the St. Catharines area. We had an incident in St. Catharines at the MTO that was very, very disturbing. So, I think that while we can pat ourselves on the back for some of the things we've done, we have a great anti-racism coalition that has sprung up in St. Catharines, but we also have to recognize that we have a long way to go.
What was it?
Yeah, the fear of the unknown is always going to be there. It will remain there, and it will remain forever. Excuse me. What we can do, however, is to engage more in more intentional educational campaigns. One of the examples of a sponsorship that we did was one that left the group that was involved in the sponsorship with the thinking of, is this a racist neighbor? So before their family arrived, they reached out to the neighbor and say, we're going to rent this house for a family that is coming from the Congo. And then the neighbor went, oh, now you're going to bring a black family here and you want the value of our properties here to go down? So the sponsors just went, well, we have made that commitment, we have signed the lease, there's nothing we can do about it. So and then the family arrived. Family arrived, very lovely family. Every time they passed near that person, they would say hi, they would smile, they would laugh. They were just so friendly and so loving that this neighbor started opening up to them and invited them out for coffee and for tea, and all of a sudden there was this friendship that blossomed. So when the sponsors realized that something like that had happened, they were just blown up and went, what happened? So the process of transformation is something that has to be ongoing, and we all have to have this open mind to be able to accept others for who they are as human beings, and to value them enough, and then to give them the opportunity to prove to themselves that they can live in a society just like all of us and be given the opportunity to be able to demonstrate that. Because the stereotype and the rhetoric and so many other things that we see on the media about some of the people who are coming into these countries are not really great. So until there is that opportunity, and for us who are working with refugees and newcomers, it is our challenge, it is our opportunity to be there at the front line and to continue to engage the Canadian public to develop that awareness of knowing that actually refugees are just human beings like all of us.
Thank you.
Right.
Martha?
Yeah, and I would just encourage another thing that we can all do is practice self-reflection and build our awareness about who we are and what our own biases are. We all have them, what our filters are and how we respond to things. That's something we can do as individuals.
Because our role is working with newcomer families in schools, and we work with both the school boards, Catholic and public school boards, and we have had incidences where the teachers, before this new school year starts, they have come up to us and we've done cultural sensitivity presentations for the school staff, which have now seen an influx of newcomer population, which they never had in the past. We had one school where there was just one little girl in grade 3 who celebrated Eid, and the whole school, pretty much the whole school, was celebrating Christmas. And during the month of December, they invited us over and we did a presentation on Eid, and the way that little girl lit up because things were so familiar, and she shared about and when the comments that she got from her friends were, "I wish I could celebrate Eid," it just made her day. And little things like these, these kids are our future. When they are being made aware at such a young age of, yes, we're different, but we're also the same, that it would go a long way. So that is something that I wanted to share. And yes, we definitely have a long way to go, but little steps like these will help us out. Yeah. Thank you.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. It's great working with professionals who can anticipate some of the lead-up questions, because we are going to wrap up this section here, but you've answered pretty much what can Niagara be doing, and we're going to start opening this up to the floor and have you start thinking about what your role is and how you can be participating in this and making this an inclusive community. But just as maybe some final comments from our panelists here, maybe on both sides, what would you say the greatest successes are, and maybe what can we be doing more? How can we really pull together to make this an inclusive community? If we can keep our comments to about a minute, 2 minutes, that'd be great.
I think one of the biggest thing would be we have wonderful agencies in Niagara region, like the Folk Arts Multicultural Center and the Fort Erie Multicultural Center, the YMCA, where we have settlement services in schools program, and newcomer information centers. I think bringing this information out to the community is a big hurdle that right now most of the immigrants are not aware that these services exist and they're free, and how beneficial they could be for somebody who's just arrived. When I would like to mention that when I first came to Canada about 12 years ago, a neighbor of mine, I had just arrived, and we were living in an apartment at that time, and our neighbor suggested going to the Y because they had employment workshops, and they also suggested the Folk Arts Multicultural Center where we would get settlement services. And if everybody was aware of that, I think it would benefit a lot. So we really need to get the word out and make everyone aware of how these programs exist in the community, and they're free, there's no cost to them. We're there to support them in every way possible. We're there in the schools, we're there in the community. They're very flexible and wonderful, amazing staff who go out of their way to support newcomers with different languages and different skills that could be very beneficial where workshops are being held for them. So I think bringing the word out of how these programs exist in the community would be very beneficial.
Thank you.
All right, so I think maybe now is a good time to open it up to the audience to ask any questions that you've been thinking about. So Bill at the front, he's going to raise his hand or stand up. He has the microphone. So if you have a question, just go up to the microphone and ask away. Thank you.
Good morning, panel. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us and provide us the insights. I am a former settlement worker on the front line as an enhanced life skill practitioner. And just to go off of the issue with language in medical appointments or language as a general issue that we've been dealing with, in Alberta they have something called Language Line. It is a contract given by the Alberta government, which I'm sure if someone were to approach the Ontario government, it would be able and accessible here in Ontario. It is just a very small feed program that you are able to access, and it has over 150 languages. It has all different dialects of Arabic and all different dialects of Farsi and Undi, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. So that is something that you guys can possibly look into. As a frontline worker, language is one of the hardest pieces that we do have to deal with when we have our clients. Also phonetics. Many languages, aside from the English language, is phonetically based. You can have somebody saying hello in Arabic in 4 different contexts, as Arabic itself is a very phonetic language that comes from very different regions. So what do you guys have within your organizations that are phonetically developed language programs to help assist language barriers and help assist language development? Thank you.
Thank you.
There are obviously phonetic components in the curriculum. There is not any, for the non-credit federal and provincial programs for language, there is not any specific phonetic program. Teachers do incorporate phonetics, obviously, into it. Brock University actually has an online developed program for phonetics. So this is very, very useful for higher levels specifically. People can look into that online program through Brock, which I believe is really quite successful. But it would certainly be something to look at. Many years ago, I suggested a phonetic program for the entire region. That is to have, we had a phonetic expert working in one of the schools, and I suggested that we have that person do an itinerant circuit throughout the region to help with every class. Of course, the funding did not become available at that point, but it obviously is a very good idea. Yeah.
As a frontline worker, the phonetics was definitely something that we did facilitate and help support with our clients. And it was very interesting to see the supports that are within the school system and the educational programs that are available to our clients. More on the community base or the organizational base, Mr. Birch, what do you have available within the Folk Art Center? I understand you have conversation circles and women's and men's groups, but what do you have that will involve the community to come in a little bit further to help even for ourselves to become phonetically immersed in other languages to correspond and develop the inclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So we've, and going back to the issue of government funding, the current federal government has actually bumped up funding for most of the settlement agencies, and so we have been able to add some components. You've mentioned conversation circles. There are also occupation-specific lessons that we can implement. If, for example, we have a group that are studying to be healthcare aides, we can gear language, toward that profession so that they can learn and understand the terms. We've had a fairly successful small business basics program where the clients can move from learning the basics of starting their own business to learning the language that's associated with it. So as Velma said, it really is dependent on funding, but we try and add those components as much as we can.
Thank you for a very informative morning so far. I really enjoyed it. My name is Sarah Daniel, and I'm a psychiatrist, but I'm here more as a community member today. I had a really quick question for Ms. Lang, and then a more detailed question for Ms. Sadek. You said that the programs are free. I have right now a nanny who's on a temporary work permit, and whenever she calls these places, they say, well, you've got to pay $100 a week or $90 a week. And for her, even though she's, paid more than minimum wage, it's still a lot of money. So if you could address that issue. And I'm very concerned because unfortunately the previous Harper government brought in the language benchmarks, which is a double-edged sword. It's good for integration in terms of getting jobs, but it's also kind of a way to keep people out of this country and not include them by making it impossible for them to attain the language benchmark by not providing the services. Well, I think it's totally unrelated, so I'll just do it quick.
Your first question was about temporary foreign workers. Unfortunately, because they are temporary, they're not included in the funding formula by the provincial or federal governments. So we have often seen this, especially with an influx of temporary foreign workers in the last 10 years. And how, the Y has always had to deal with these questions from people, and how do they learn language, and then how do they get a job, and so on and so on. Again, it's that revolving door, what comes first and what can be done. Unfortunately, the government policy will have to change with regards to including temporary foreign workers in classes, free classes.
So I just hope that somebody will be able to take that initiative to take the policy question, because it's basically using these people as workers,
yes,
and then having them as a permanent migrant underclass to do work that Canadians don't want to do. So it's actually, I think, a racist and abusive policy. So I hope there's some way to deal with it. My second question is relating to the education system. I'm really excited to hear that you have this initiative, and I guess I'm just trying to hopefully maybe foster a linkage. I'm Muslim. My child goes to Catholic school, and I'm on the Catholic Parent Council. So I found out that's, I think, what Moses Moini said about linkages of different organizations. So I wanted to suggest, I don't know if you're already doing that, I just wanted to know how you're helping let the parents know what's happening about their kids. So for example, I just met a mother coming out of school at a Catholic high school. She had no idea about the Safe School Connects program, which is where you report an absence. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure the Catholic school and public school have versions of that. So a lot of the kids are self-reporting absences and giving their own email addresses to play hooky.
Yes.
Right, and then this particular mother disclosed to me that she's actually concerned her kid's going with the wrong crowd, which is a drug crowd, and she wants him to hang out with my kid, who so far, by God's grace, is not in that crowd. So what is your agency doing in terms of getting at the parents that are not necessarily identified problem children or issue children, to get kind of just basic, come to the parent-teacher meetings, come to this kind of information. So, and the second question is, my school is actually launching an initiative that I think is a perfect inclusion idea, where they're going to invite community agencies to a fair for the kids to do their community service hours. So I would really welcome whatever agencies to contact. My school is it's St. Francis Catholic Secondary School, but what they're going to do is, some of the kids don't do hours with the community enough to graduate. So they're trying to invite these agencies in, and I think it's a great idea for many schools to do that, because not only will you get them to do their community hours, but you'll also get to have a kid who's a Canadian kid be able to link with maybe a newcomer kid and have that, I think what Ms. Lang said about cultural facilitation, not just language facilitation. And just to end on that, if you can answer that question, but a kid, a principal, vice principal approached my kid and said, "Oh, do you speak Arabic?" Well, my kid's born in Edmonton. He speaks English. He speaks a bit of French, but it's the assumptions that just because you're not white or not Anglo-Saxon, all of a sudden that you're going to have language facility in a language just because you happen to have that ethnic characteristic. So I think there's a lot of teaching on the other side as well. Thank you.
That's actually a wonderful question. We have come across situations like these. I would like to, for some of you who are not aware, my staff and we cover about 27 schools on a scheduled weekly basis, and about 28 on itinerant basis, St. Francis being one of them. Because it is not one of our site schools, so we come on the request of either the parents or the school staff to the school if there is such a situation. However, we are trying to promote our program more and more because, again, as I said earlier, when I gave that example of that little girl, there is just one person, but they are in need. And we sometimes are not just interpreters, language interpreters, we are also cultural mediators. For students, my own children were born here. Their first language is not what I speak with them and try to speak with them at home, but it is English. But the cultural barriers, the culture that we have at home and what they have, sometimes they need somebody from the same culture to empathize with them and know what they're going through. And as I was mentioning, we are trying to promote our program more and more, and we would definitely love to be a part of that fair that you are having. And Folk Arts Multicultural Center has a wonderful program called Community Connections, and where they are given opportunities to students where they can get their community service hours. And actually, one of our summer programs that Swiss has every year, and it is held in 4 different schools, 2 Catholic and 2 public schools, where we have 20 peer leaders. We select them from these schools and from certain other schools in high schools in Niagara, and we run a summer program for students who are new to Canada and will be going into high school for the first time in Canada. So they might be grade 12, but going into high school for the first time. So it is known as the Newcomer Orientation Week. It is a 4-day program where these peer leaders, which we train and are already in schools, help those new students understand the Canadian school system and it gives them an opportunity to make friends before they actually start high school, know how to select subjects, what to expect when they first go into high school, and little things like these. And they are given, these peer leaders then are their buddies throughout that school year. We have had, we are now trying to have white Canadian born students in that program so they can act as a buddy for those newcomer students throughout the school year. Education, yes, as I said, had mentioned earlier, it is usually mostly on the request of the school staff that we can come into school, but of course once we are, if the parent is aware of this program, they have, every school has a list of our Swiss workers and the languages that they cover with their phone, with their contact information. So if you are in a school, you can ask the secretary or the school staff and ask for a Swiss worker contact information. They would be able to provide you with it.
Thank you. So I think we have another question. Go
yes. First of all, I want to thank the panelists this morning. I'm Lisa Smith. I'm an ESL instructor for Niagara Falls Arts Multicultural Center. And my question is about raising awareness among the Niagara schools where there isn't a lot of diversity. So for example, maybe schools in Pelham in particular. What sort of programs, if any, do you have in educating that community about the existence of refugees within the greater Niagara region? Because I feel that, you know, even if there aren't students who are from Syria or other areas in the, you know, how do you educate the more homogeneous communities?
Part of our role as a settlement worker in school, we conduct different workshops. We have, and that information is actually given out to our school staff at the beginning of the school year, where we have a list of presentations which we present to students for different age groups, especially in elementary schools, where we do presentations on immigration, on how to become a Canadian citizen, what are the requirements, on different holidays around the world, and peer pressure, and things like these, and it gives them the opportunity to learn how to become a global citizen. It gives the young children an opportunity to learn and ask questions. And we have these workshops, they're open to all. We're very flexible because we do these presentations for them in different age groups. So it could be done as for the whole school in a gym, or it could be individualized as young as kindergarten, JK, and SK as well, that we've done diversity presentations for. So it brings that awareness piece, and if they have any questions, we make them like little things where my staff and we make them guess, where do you think we're from, what language do you think I speak? And so it opens up the conversation. And they have that opportunity to ask us any sort of questions.
Are these workshops specifically, like, is that a volunteer thing for the church, for the school to say, we would like to have that at our school? Or is it kind of mandatory that every school on the board does this type of work?
Actually, at the beginning of the school year, we give our workshop list to the school staff, and then the need, if there is a specific need for their school, or if they would just like to have that presentation done. So it's not mandatory, it's voluntarily, and before we go in, we ask the school staff who asked for that presentation, what do they expect the outcome to be? So that gives us the opportunity to mold it according to their need.
Because I think to the question, you know, you have these communities that might go, oh, we don't need this because we don't have any, and yet they need it.
They
right?
need it, yes.
Maybe even more so than other communities that are very diverse, because they've already learned how to welcome these newcomers. Here's a community that's a little bit more, you know what I mean, all the same. So it's being able to be kind of specific and intentional to that. Yes, at the back.
So I have one last question
Yes.
for you.
Hi, my name is Desmond Sequeira. I want to draw attention to that question over there on the screen, which says, what criteria can we use to measure inclusiveness, or what are the markers of inclusion? I would like to submit that, needless to say, and I'm glad some of the panelists drew attention to that, is that Niagara is not an inclusive society yet, and we have a long way to go, which is one of the reasons why we have now in Niagara the Niagara Anti-Racism Coalition, and a subcommittee of that coalition is called White Supremacy Awareness. So my question would be, what distinction do we make between the formal kinds of inclusion which we have been talking about this morning, as distinguished from the really informal kinds of inclusion that we may talk about, and to which I believe Moses Moini, I hope I got their last name pronounced correctly, was beginning to draw a direction towards, where informal inclusion. I guess my somewhat disturbing question might be is, how really integrated do we want newcomers to be in our society? And the reverse of that question would be, how really integrated would newcomers want to be as part of Canadian society? Because my opinion is that unless there is total integration, not far down the road, we will be facing a situation as exists in Europe, where we have the ghettoization of communities, and with, of course, the well-known resultant consequences of that situation. Just to give you an example, which might disturb a lot of us, is that I am very familiar with an ESL worker a few years ago, who has, it happened entirely informally and quite spontaneously. One of the immediate newcomers to her ESL class ended up marrying her sister. Now, that could be scary for a lot of people. And I'm wondering, therefore, to repeat my question, what do we mean by real inclusion, the markers of inclusion? Thank you.
I would just like to say, one of the things I notice about inclusion or not is that we don't notice it. It sounds kind of weird, but when we don't notice our differences anymore is an indicator to me that we have that we're integrated or inclusive with other communities. When you see gatherings that include many diverse people and everyone is feeling observing that there is a feeling of connection amongst the group, amongst the people. It may be oversimplified, but I think a key is when we don't notice that we're different.
Anyone else?
I think that the second part of your question, which was about how integrated do newcomers want to become, that's the key question, really. I think when we let them decide that they would like to be more integrated and the doors are open, then that is really what needs to happen. We should not be deciding how inclusive we want to be, but I think they need to be able to determine for themselves, do we want to be more involved with the mainstream, so-called, of our society.
And that's, I think, a good segue just to inform you guys that in the afternoon we'll have a panel of speakers from newcomers themselves. So you'll be able to hear some of their viewpoints on their experience in Niagara, and there's an ability to ask them questions as well in the afternoon starting at 1 o'clock. But now it's 12 o'clock, and this is the conclusion of the first panel, so thank you very much to our panelists. And I will turn it over to Dorothy to talk about the lunch.
Thank you. And the mic is coming, but I can use my big voice. Thank you. Just a few things. I'm thinking back to this morning, and I don't even know if I told you that my name is Dorothy Franklin, but I should have, and I had the privilege and pleasure of leading the planning team for this event. So I'm going to give you some practical information, and I'm going to make some acknowledgements. So while this is happening, if anybody needs to leave at lunchtime, and I know there are people who will be, there is a pink evaluation sheet in your program. So if you are leaving, would you please fill out the questions having to do with the morning? And if you're going out the doors onto St. Paul Street, a couple of our volunteers will collect it from you there. And if you're going out these doors, you can hand it to me on your way by, and we would appreciate that. In terms of acknowledgements, we have quite a few members of the planning team with us here today, and I'd just like to ask all those people to stand, please, so that you can see some of the people who helped make today possible. I also did notice, and I haven't been in touch with the registration desk, but I do believe that there was a city councillor from Port Colborne who was registered to be here today, and I don't know if she is here, and if she is, maybe we could ask her to stand. Is Ms. Demaray here? No, okay. And speaking of Pelham, the mayor of Pelham had also indicated he would be here this morning, but I don't think I've seen Dave Augustin. Is he here? Okay, well, anyways, we tried. What I want to let you know also is that this day was made possible by funding from 3 levels of the United Church of Canada. We received, after an application, some funding from the United Church of Canada Foundation Embracing the Spirit Innovation Grant. The regional body, our Niagara Presbytery, from their Extension Fund Mission Grant supported us, and the local congregation here at Silver Spire also supported this event. We are going to be moving on to lunch. And it is a vegetarian lunch for those who have some concerns about food. And the caterer has told me that anything gluten-free or with nuts will be marked, so you should be fine for food. We are asking, for those who can afford it, it is a free lunch, but we also will be collecting Pay What You Can donations, and a suggested donation of $10, if possible, would really help us bring this day in on budget, which would really be appreciated. When you go to lunch, there is an hour for lunch, so that's quite a bit of time. During the lunch hour, upstairs in our top floor in the gym are 18 different community service providers and their displays. So if you are wanting to find out some of the services available in Niagara, please go up and visit them. For the first 50 people who go to the gym upstairs, we have had a donation from Niagara Folk Arts Multicultural Centre of some carrier bags, and you will be the proud recipient of a folk arts bag if you go up to the top floor and visit all the displays. I would also like to mention that on the side tables there is an update from June this year of the Syrian refugee program provided by Region of Niagara staff who serve on the local immigration partnership that was mentioned by the panel this morning. So if you have a particular interest in that, please help yourself to that handout. During lunch, there is a community art project that you can participate in, making your mark, and it is on the stage in the auditorium. In the balcony of the auditorium, our keynote speaker, who is speaking at 3, Zarka Nawaz, will be available and there will be copies of her book that you can purchase and she will sign if you wish to do that. So what I'm going to suggest is there's lots of food. If you did not register because you came late, you should go to the registration desk on the balcony for a lunch ticket if you were registered for lunch. There will be people collecting the tickets for lunch, but I'm going to suggest some of you might want to start on the balcony and upstairs and then go down for your lunch. And if you want to, you can come back at 1:45, and there will be an experiential inclusion exercise here in the sanctuary. Well, what's that? Well, you'll just have to come and see. I would like to thank our moderators, Yusuf and Ton, and let's have another round for our wonderful panel.
Before we go to lunch, I'm going to give you some homework. I know our tendency is to talk about rhymes with Trump. Anyways, don't do that. Stories are powerful. Share your stories, and that's how we're going to build community. So make an effort doing that during your lunchtime. Sit with people you don't know and share your story.
Oh, and on a very practical note, there are also washrooms on the upper level off the gym and downstairs off the auditorium. We probably should have scheduled a break during this morning, so sorry about that, folks.
Very well done, Rohina.
I loved what you had to say. Oh my goodness.
Really? Like what? Specifically?
Specifically about